Imagine this: you're on your own property, enjoying the peace and freedom of your land. You're doing nothing illegal, nothing wrong, and yet, someone decides to take matters into their own hands and call the cops on you. That's exactly what happened to me. I've always believed that a ranch should be a place where you can live on your own terms, free from the interference of others. Owning property in a rural area offers a sense of freedom that few can understand. Where I live, hunting, shooting, and outdoor activities aren't just hobbies, they're a way of life. I've always respected the land, followed all the laws, and made sure that my actions didn't affect anyone else. A few weeks ago, I was on my property practicing some target shooting. I had set up a safe shooting area, well away from any houses or public spaces. The land around me is vast, and I had made sure to follow all safety protocols. Targets were set up in a designated zone, and I was being as responsible as I could possibly be. I wasn't disturbing anyone, wasn't firing recklessly, and was simply enjoying a moment of peace and personal time to hone my skills. But that's when the HOA stepped in. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had sent out several complaints. According to them, my shooting was causing a disturbance. They claimed it was a safety hazard and that they had a responsibility to protect the community. This statement was laughable. I knew my land, I knew the safety protocols, and there was no danger to anyone or anything around me. But to the HOA, it didn't matter. They were concerned about how the sound of gunshots might upset the neighbors or create unnecessary anxiety. Their complaints didn't stop there. I received several letters from the HOA insisting that I stop firing my gun on my own property, or else they would escalate the issue. They were trying to dictate how I could use my land, telling me that I needed to respect some vague community standards that didn't even apply to my rural setting. It was as if the HOA had forgotten that I owned the land and had every right to use it responsibly. A few days later, I got the surprise of my life. A squad car pulled up to my ranch. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. The HOA had called the cops on me. An officer stepped out of the car, and the situation was immediately clear. The HOA had escalated things to the point where law enforcement was now involved. It wasn't just a neighborly complaint, it had become a legal issue, despite the fact that I was doing absolutely nothing wrong. The officer was polite but firm. He informed me that the department had received multiple complaints about gunfire on my property and had been instructed to investigate the situation. I immediately explained the situation to him, calmly stating that I was on my own land, using a legal firearm, and I had every right to shoot. I also showed him the proper permits for the gun I was using and outlined all of the safety precautions I had in place. After listening to my explanation, the officer seemed to understand. He said there was no law being broken and no further action needed to be taken. He was just following protocol, and I could tell that he didn't really believe the complaints that had been made against me. He even complimented my setup, remarking that I had been very responsible in how I'd set everything up for safe shooting. While the officer left with no further issues, I was still frustrated. The situation had escalated unnecessarily. What should have been a routine day of shooting on my own land had turned into an ordeal because of an HOA that had no business telling me how to use my property. The entire situation felt like an invasion. The HOA had taken it upon themselves to treat me like I was doing something wrong when, in reality, I was following the law and being a responsible gun owner. As I stood there, watching the officer leave, the sense of injustice lingered. Here I was, on my own land, doing nothing wrong, and yet I had been made to feel like a criminal. The HOA had overstepped its bounds, and this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attempt to control how I used my property. But what was worse was the fact that the HOA was willing to go to such lengths to enforce their vague and arbitrary rules. Instead of coming to me directly and discussing the situation, they had decided to involve law enforcement and escalate the matter without any understanding of the circumstances. The fact that they had called the cops on me without even attempting to resolve the issue directly showed how little they cared about fair resolution. They just wanted to maintain control, to dictate what I could and couldn't do. The situation made me realize how dangerous it can be when organizations like an HOA assume they have the right to control personal property rights. They might have the power to enforce certain rules in a community, but they can't dictate how someone uses their private land, especially when the landowner is following the law. As frustrating as the encounter was, it also motivated me to take a stand. The HOA wasn't going to dictate how I used my property, and I would make sure they knew that. It wasn't just about the shooting, it was about standing up for my rights as a landowner and ensuring that no one could push me around because of their misguided complaints. This incident became a turning point. It taught me that when it comes to your rights, you can't afford to back down, even when the HOA tries to bully you into submission. The whole ordeal left me fuming. The audacity of the HOA to involve law enforcement over something completely legal was frustrating. Here I was, minding my own business on my own land, doing absolutely nothing wrong. I wasn't threatening anyone, I wasn't causing any harm. In fact, I was taking every precaution to ensure that I was following the law and maintaining safety. But that wasn't enough for the HOA. Instead of coming to me directly or having a calm discussion about their concerns, they jumped straight to drastic measures by involving the police. They didn't even give me a chance to explain myself before calling for the cops. That's where their hypocrisy became glaringly obvious. What really irritated me was the fact that the HOA was supposed to be an organization that existed to protect the community. That was their role, presumably to keep the neighborhood safe, to mediate issues, and to ensure the property values were upheld. But in this case, it wasn't the community they were trying to protect, it was their own self-appointed sense of control. They were so concerned with maintaining authority over everyone that they failed to see the bigger picture. They were causing the very problem they claimed to be solving. I had every right to be on my property, doing exactly what I was doing. I wasn't endangering anyone, I wasn't setting fires, and I wasn't disturbing the peace. I had followed all the necessary procedures. I'd set up targets in a safe area, far from any buildings or public spaces, and I was using my gun responsibly. But rather than seeing a responsible gun owner taking care to respect the land and others around him, the HOA saw an opportunity to exert control. Their complaint about a safety hazard was laughable. They didn't even understand how firearms work, nor did they seem to care about the reality of gun ownership. Safety in gun ownership isn't just about rules and regulations, it's about understanding the responsibilities that come with it. I had taken steps to ensure that I wasn't putting anyone at risk. The area was far away from any houses, and I had placed backstops to catch any stray shots. If anyone knew anything about firearm safety, they'd know I was doing everything correctly. Instead of appreciating that I was being a responsible and law-abiding citizen, the HOA's main concern was their perception of what was acceptable. They were more worried about what the neighbors might think, more focused on their authority, than actually fostering a safe and healthy community. In reality, the only hazard in this situation was the HOA itself. They were the ones who escalated a minor issue into a full-blown confrontation. As I thought more about it, I realized that the HOA's real problem was not the gunfire, but the fact that I wasn't bowing to their authority. They wanted control over everything, from how people used their properties to how they lived their lives. The HOA seemed to believe that it was their job to regulate every tiny detail of their residents' lives. But what they didn't realize was that they were overstepping. They didn't have the right to interfere with my land and tell me how to use it. This wasn't just about guns, it was about respect for personal property and personal freedom. I realized that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or an isolated incident. This was a pattern. The HOA had a history of overstepping their bounds, making unnecessary rules, and attempting to control everything they could. They believed they could dictate how people should live, what they should do on their own property, and how they should behave in their own homes. It wasn't just about controlling the use of firearms, it was about a deeper desire to control the lives of everyone in the community. The more I thought about the situation, the more it made my blood boil. They didn't have any legal ground to stand on. I wasn't violating any laws, and I certainly wasn't causing any problems. In fact, if anything, I was a responsible gun owner doing what I had every right to do. But the HOA wasn't concerned with rights or facts, they were concerned with power. They were concerned with making sure that their version of acceptable behavior was the only one that mattered. I was done playing nice. I had been patient, trying to appease them, but it was clear that the HOA had no interest in reasonable compromise. They thought they could simply walk all over me and push me around. They thought they could control how I lived my life and used my land. That was a mistake. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The more they pushed, the more I realized it was time for me to push back. They had made their move, and now it was time for me to make mine. This wasn't just about shooting on my property, it was about standing up for what I believed in. It was about protecting my rights as a property owner, standing up against an organization that had clearly overstepped its bounds. I wasn't going to let them control me or intimidate me. I knew that I had the law on my side. The HOA might have thought they could control me, but they didn't understand that the real power lay with the individuals who knew their rights. I was determined to show them that I wasn't just going to accept their overreach. I wasn't going to let them dictate how I used my land. And if they thought calling the cops on me was going to make me back down, they had another thing coming. The HOA's hypocrisy wasn't just about their actions, it was about their inability to see the bigger picture. They didn't care about what was right or wrong. They only cared about controlling their community and maintaining a sense of authority. They had targeted me, and now I was ready to turn the tables. After the police left, I sat there, boiling with anger. My property, my rights, and my peace had been disrupted by an organization that had no business getting involved in how I chose to live my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a matter of being frustrated with the HOA's interference. It was about something bigger, the audacity of an organization to think they had the right to dictate what I could or could not do on my own land. The HOA had already shown me how far they were willing to go. They didn't hesitate to escalate things to the police over something completely legal, something that wasn't even remotely harming anyone. They weren't concerned with fairness or understanding, they were concerned with their own sense of control. They thought they could intimidate me into submission, and that pissed me off. But as I stewed over the situation, a thought came to mind that turned everything on its head. Why should I sit back and let them have the upper hand? Why should I let them decide what's acceptable on my property when I had every right to use it the way I saw fit? This wasn't just about shooting or guns, it was about standing up for my rights as a landowner. I realized then that it wasn't enough for me to just defend myself. It was time for me to take the fight to them. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. I would turn the tables. Instead of just sitting on the defensive and waiting for the HOA to make their next move, I would make them face the consequences of their overreach. It was time for me to show them just how far I was willing to go to protect my rights. If they wanted to control how I used my property, then I would give them a taste of their own medicine. So, I made a bold decision. I went straight to the HOA's land, a large plot of community property they had reserved as common land. This land wasn't much different from my own property. It was part of the HOA's collective domain, and it was located on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The HOA had always maintained control over it, dictating what could be done with the space. I knew it was a big stretch, but I decided I would turn part of that land into my own shooting range. I wasn't going to be reckless or cause harm, but I was determined to show the HOA that they didn't have the monopoly on dictating what happens in the neighborhood. If they thought they could take control of my life and my land, then I would show them that I could take control of theirs. It was a calculated move, but it was also a message that would make them realize that they couldn't just bully people into submission. I began to make plans. First, I carefully considered how I would set up the shooting range. I didn't want to be reckless or violate any rules, so I made sure to plan everything safely. I set up the targets far from any homes or public spaces, just like I had done on my own property. I took every necessary precaution to ensure that the range was safe and well contained. I wasn't interested in causing any harm, but I was determined to make a statement. I knew that once I started setting things up, the HOA would notice, and that was exactly the point. My plan wasn't about being malicious. It was about forcing the HOA to realize that they couldn't impose their will on others without consequences. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. If they thought they could come onto my property and control how I lived my life, then I would make them realize that I wasn't going to be their pawn. The message was clear: if they wanted to involve themselves in my life, they would have to deal with the fallout. Over the next few days, I quietly but steadily began setting up the shooting range. I made sure everything was done legally, and I ensured that it wouldn't create a safety risk for anyone. As the days went on, the project took shape, and the shooting range began to emerge on the HOA's land. I knew it wouldn't take long for the neighbors, and especially the HOA, to notice. But that was exactly what I wanted. The moment they realized what I was doing, they would understand that I was serious. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them push me around. I kept my movements deliberate and cautious, but I also knew that the message I was sending was going to be loud and clear. I wasn't afraid of their rules, and I wasn't afraid to stand up for what was mine. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how satisfying this move was going to be. For too long, the HOA had thought they had control over everyone's life. But now, I was showing them that I wasn't just another person they could boss around. I was a landowner who knew my rights and wasn't afraid to fight for them. The thought of seeing the HOA scramble to deal with this unexpected turn of events made me feel a sense of power that I hadn't experienced before. I wasn't just reacting to their moves anymore, I was calling the shots. And when the HOA came to address the situation, I'd be ready to stand my ground and make sure they understood that I was no longer going to be passive. It was time to take the fight to them. At first, I just set up a small target range. Nothing over the top. I wasn't trying to make a spectacle of it, I simply placed a few simple targets and set up some safe backstops. I wasn't shooting at anything too extreme, just enough to make a statement and give the HOA a taste of their own medicine. It was all legal, safe, and respectful of the space around me. But once the HOA caught wind of it, things escalated quickly, and the fallout was immediate. The HOA, which had already been critical of my gun use on my own property, quickly became furious. The community members who had already complained about my shooting activities now started to raise new concerns. They were complaining about the noise, the disruption, and now, it seemed, the very presence of a shooting range on the HOA's own land. Word spread fast throughout the neighborhood, and soon enough, my little action had become the hot topic of conversation. As expected, the complaints didn't take long to flood into the HOA office. Some residents were upset about the noise, others about the potential safety concerns, even though I had taken every precaution to ensure it was a controlled, safe environment. There were murmurs of "this is going too far" and "he's gone too far with this stunt." Some residents thought I had crossed a line, while others feared that I had made a mockery of their precious HOA rules. The HOA was in damage control mode, scrambling to contain the situation before it spiraled out of control. But what really struck me was how quickly they reacted. They hadn't even bothered to come to me first before making their initial complaints about my shooting, but now, with the tables turned, they were desperate to reach out. They called, sent emails, and even knocked on my door. But I didn't respond right away. No, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. They had pushed me into a corner before, and now, it was time for them to feel the pressure. I wanted them to stew in their own panic for a while. I wanted them to experience the helplessness of being on the receiving end of their own attempts to control someone else's life. For once, I was the one who wasn't going to back down, and I made it clear that I wasn't intimidated. Days passed without any word from me. As the HOA's anxiety grew, their attempts to regain control became more desperate. It became clear that they didn't know what to do. The situation had gotten out of hand, and now they had to face the consequences of their earlier actions. They had acted recklessly by calling the cops on me, trying to control what I did on my own property, and now they were paying the price. Their hasty decision to involve law enforcement was coming back to haunt them, and they were finally realizing that they had overstepped their bounds. The neighborhood was divided. Some residents were vocal in their support of me, arguing that the HOA had no right to impose rules that infringed on my property rights. Others, however, stood by the HOA, concerned about the noise and what they saw as a disruption to the neighborhood's tranquility. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that the HOA could no longer simply ignore the situation. Within days, they held an emergency meeting. They gathered to discuss how they would handle the fallout from this mess. It was a scramble. They had no real plan of action, and they were struggling to come up with a solution that wouldn't make them look like they had made a huge mistake. The pressure was on, and they knew it. This wasn't just a small issue anymore. It had snowballed into a full-blown crisis that they could no longer control. The HOA was in full panic mode. They realized they had made a huge error in judgment by trying to control my actions and by escalating the issue with law enforcement. Now, they had to address the fallout from their reckless decision to get involved in my life. The HOA board members were at odds with one another, trying to figure out whether they should backtrack and apologize or double down and enforce stricter rules to prevent something like this from happening again. As the days went by, I watched from the sidelines, content to let them flounder. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. The HOA had seen what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their own interference, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. I wasn't going to back down, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them either. The truth was, I had won. Not because I had set up a shooting range on the HOA's land, but because I had stood my ground. I had made it clear that I wasn't afraid of them, that I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. The HOA had spent so much time trying to control every little aspect of their residents' lives, but now they had to deal with the reality of the consequences of their overreach. At the end of the day, the HOA had to learn a hard lesson. They couldn't just control people's lives, dictate how they used their own property, and expect there wouldn't be repercussions. They had made a grave mistake, and now it was time for them to deal with the mess they had created. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up for your rights isn't just about winning a fight, it's about sending a message that people will no longer tolerate unnecessary control and manipulation. And in this case, I had sent that message loud and clear. In the end, I didn't get another visit from the cops. The HOA realized they had made an enemy out of someone who wasn't going to just roll over. They sent me a few emails, some polite letters, and even made attempts to smooth things over, trying to reestablish the false sense of control they thought they had over me. But by this point, I wasn't interested in their apologies or their attempts to make amends. I had made my point loud and clear, and there was no way I was going to let them off the hook so easily. The HOA had crossed the line, and it wasn't just about the shooting range. It wasn't about the gunfire or the noise or anything related to that. It was about their overreach, about their belief that they could control every aspect of my life. When they involved the police, when they took it upon themselves to dictate how I could use my own property, they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated me, assuming that I would bow down and comply. What they didn't realize was that by making that call to the cops, they had handed me the perfect opportunity to stand my ground and fight for what was mine. When I stood up to them, when I made my bold move and created that shooting range, I wasn't just defending my right to shoot on my own property. I was defending my autonomy, my ownership, and my ability to live on my terms. The HOA had assumed they could control everything, but in doing so, they had made me realize how much I valued my freedom, my privacy, and my right to make decisions about my land. It wasn't about proving a point, it was about taking control of my own destiny and showing them that I wouldn't be bullied into submission. The HOA was forced to retract their complaints. It wasn't a matter of them conceding any sort of moral high ground, they were simply backed into a corner. They knew they had lost this battle, and the only option left for them was to back off. They realized that they had no legal grounds to stand on, and they couldn't just continue to harass me without consequences. Their attempts to bully me into silence had failed, and now they had to face the reality of their own actions. What they hadn't accounted for, however, was the ripple effect their overreach had caused. By pushing me to the point where I had to fight for my rights, they had inadvertently taught me, and others in the community, a valuable lesson. I had shown that standing up for yourself, no matter how intimidating the odds, was not only possible but necessary. And more importantly, I had set an example for others who may have been too afraid to challenge the authority of the HOA. The land that they once tried to control, that they thought they could dictate how I used, was now being used in a way that they couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the shooting range itself, it was the fact that I had made a stand. I had taken my property back from their grasp, and I wasn't going to let them treat me like someone they could walk over. The moment I set up that range, I was taking ownership of my land in a way they had never expected. I was no longer the one who had to comply with their arbitrary rules. Instead, I was the one setting the rules. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to take notice. Some residents quietly congratulated me for standing up for myself, while others expressed their respect for the way I had handled the situation. The HOA had made it clear that they believed they had ultimate control, but now their authority was in question. They had miscalculated their influence, and it had backfired spectacularly. The experience had taught me something far more valuable than simply regaining control over my land. It taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, especially when others try to intimidate you into silence. When someone oversteps their bounds, when they try to dictate what you can and can't do with your own property, it's essential to stand firm. The HOA might have thought they could push me around, but in the end, they learned the hard way.